We belong to a time when global trade is slowing, but it's also evolving, from new supply chain routes to fresh trade and investment corridors. In this world of decoupling and deglobalization, a company like DHL sits at the crossroads of conflicting and converging trends. So, in the latest episode of Corner Office Conversation, I speak to its global CEO, Tobias Meyer, on whether trade is indeed losing its edge, the China and the China plus one question, the rise of South Asia and India, and how DHL is managing to stay ahead of the curve. Hi, Tobias. Very warm welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. We are at a time when global trade is not outpacing GDP like it used to. For decades it did, and now it's barely managing to keep up. And this is something you said in a recent analyst conversation as well. It's no longer a multiplier. How does that change things for a company like DHL?
So first of all, we expected that the multiplier would drop at some point. It's the saying, which is quite obvious, nothing outgrows GDP forever. That's quite natural, but it has happened obviously in a different way than expected. It wasn't a normal narrowing, but we see some factors that induce volatility. And I think that's what people are more wrestling with. Where is trade growing? Where are markets growing? Where are markets accessible? And where does not? Where do we have adverse factors that make it more difficult to trade? And how do I deal with that as a company? That's a question that our customers ask themselves. The changes in global trade and US trade policy specifically are first and foremost impacting our customers. Shifting manufacturing is much more difficult than shifting aircrafts around. We also have physical infrastructure on the ground. But nonetheless, shifting value chain is much more difficult than shifting logistics. So that's why we're also so intensely discussing this topic of global trade and where to produce for which market with our customers.
We'll come to the US in just a bit, but before that, as more and more countries, of course led by the US, refrain from globalization and supply chain networks across the world fragment into what we can call regional blocks, what would the term global presence mean for a company like DHL now? And is it as big an advantage as it used to be?
So first, I don't see enough evidence for that narrative.
Okay.
If you look at our DHL connectedness parameter that we do together with NUAU Stern, so with academic support, the distance of global trade, the kilometers and miles that goods travel have never been as large as in the first half of 2025.
Right, yes.
Trade is increasing. Yes, we have setbacks, we have changes, particularly driven by the US, but you also have to recognize what happens in response. The EU getting the Mercosur trade agreement over the line after many years of that being stagnant. Also India, Europe, I think on a new type of level with new urgency on both sides to make that happen, and that would be a great thing. If finally those relatively small areas of disagreement are overcome with a recognition of the greater good that such a trade agreement would have. So there is the practical view, but there's also the conceptual view. Not every country will be able to produce leading technology, leading pharmaceuticals, leading medical devices, leading electronics. The US is in a unique position as the world's largest market to force some shift of production, some substitution of imports. Most other nations are not in that situation. I would argue even India is not in that situation. And if you then erect high barriers to trade, you also ban innovation. You ban cost competitiveness when it comes to exports, because if you want to produce advanced goods, you need imports as well. You need to participate in the technological advances of other nations that can supply for your product as well.
Right. But do you see a dual decoupling happening? We'll talk about China plus one and what it means for India. But along with that, there's also a sense of US plus one. And of course, when you talk of nearshoring, Mexico is at the top of your G20 list. What does that mean for a company like DHL?
So we clearly see a bifurcation. So we see an increasing geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. That's clear, and that's also now evidenced in the development of trade. The trade China has with the US and vice versa is shrinking. This also, though, the measures taken on the US side leads to a certain decoupling of the US, because it's not only affecting China as the geopolitical rival that is seen on the US side, at least by some, but the US has also chosen to impose tariffs on other nations, also traditional allies, and also countries where the United States actually has a trade surplus, which raises the question, what's the objective of this? And I think that's what many observers are wrestling with. The list of objectives that has been named on the US side is very long, but it's not a consistent list. If you, for instance, want to balance the trade deficit, you need to also, or one way would be to increase exports. When you have trade policies that make export more difficult, make exports less competitive, that will not happen. So I think that's where people are seeking for answers. Our customers are trying to find out what's the real objective, to have a better sense of what's going to happen next and what's going to be the steady state in this very dynamically evolving landscape.
Right. I'm just curious, in this, it's such a volatile world, right? From US's executive decisions to a time where I think there are the maximum number of conflicts that we've ever had since World War II. Do you have to constantly go back to the drawing board? And which of your segments are the most impacted? Which constantly demand a recycling of thought and planning for the company?
So we have an inherently resilient setup through our 5 divisions. And we left it that way. We didn't integrate, also because we knew that this would be an important asset in a volatile world. Now it creates some complications. Also, we need to explain this to our customers. We need to facilitate. There are obviously some overlaps between what we do. If you think about international express, international air freight being handled in a different division. So we recognize that need, and I think we're working on really providing a more seamless interface to our customers in explaining ourselves better. But when it comes to this volatility that you're mentioning, it is a real strength because those business systems are very agile. If you look over the last quarters, how we have been able to flex our asset-intensive international express network, how we shifted aircraft around, including shifting it across jurisdictions. That is really, I think, a job well done by my colleagues in those areas. So that's what I think also makes us unique in this setting. We're not only the most global company, but we're also an inherently resilient company, which is also very important for our customers who rely on us to access markets, who rely on us to keep inbound supply chains to manufacturing going, and thereby keep producing output.
All right. Tell me, let's come to DHL's strengths and how it's trying to, you said the volatility is actually real strength for you. 3 trends that you mentioned in terms of global trade very recently are China plus one, which we discussed, the rise of South Asia, and new FDI inflow routes. Tell me how DHL is taking advantage of each of these trends.
So China plus one, I think, has been around, but has not only accelerated, but also really changed. There is a clear sense that the supply, particularly of technology from China to the US, is not going to work that way anymore, and vice versa. And that on the tech space means a fundamental reset of some supply chains, which has now started, India being part of that on the mobile phone side, for instance. But I think that will continue and might well deepen, especially if conditions here continue to improve in the way they have done over the last 10 years. We see that rise in the rankings, different rankings of competitiveness and that is important to companies. So the semiconductor industry, I think, could well take a strong foothold here as well in the years to come. So that's what's now changing. That is not only a China plus one, but it's also kind of a US plus one. Because people do recognize I might need to have a presence in the US to supply the local market, but I need a different setup to be cost competitive in other regions as well.
Sure.
So that is the new type of China plus one discussion, which is really having both those elements, diversification away from China due to geopolitical reasons, but also a different setup around the US, given the high and probably also somewhat permanent barriers to trade in forms of tariffs. So that's something that our customers are clearly working on, and that also has an impact on our business. What we have already done with Strategy 2030, which we communicated a little bit over a year ago, I think we had a sense of that changing environment, and we said we need to be proactive about that and singled out 20 countries that have strong intrinsic growth, but also are resilient or even benefit from this new geopolitical setup. So we had already for a year now a very specific eye on those countries. India is one of those, to make sure we're ready for growth, but we also more integrate across our divisions, and we target those markets through investments much more pointedly.
Give me a list of the top 3 most exciting emerging markets for you. And is this list, more importantly, is this list different from what you would have had, say, a year and a half back?
So I was always bullish, and DHL always was bullish on emerging markets. We always found difficult places, for historical reasons, good to operate. It's not easy, but it can be very rewarding. If you look at our market share in Africa, on the express side, it's by far leading. There are, many countries actually where nobody else is really in town. We were always very committed to Asia. I often call Asia DHL's second home market. So we are very interested in developing geographies, and we are also interested in remote places. We want to be present everywhere. We want to connect every person on this planet who wants to ship something to somebody else. That's our mission, and that's why we're very excited about developing markets, India included, but also Southeast Asia. You mentioned that, Middle East and Africa. We now pick 20 countries that are sizable, that are have growth, intrinsic growth, but also benefit, or at least are resilient to the geopolitical scenario that we're facing. So that has been a specific focus since we launched Strategy 2030.
Right. How are your Asia routes adjusting with the Red Sea and the Suez congestion? I mean, is it still a constant state of recalibration, or have you reached a stage where it's comfortable now and business as usual before the next disruption comes, maybe?
Well, I think the disruption in the Red Sea is a constant by now. Most traffic, nearly all traffic, goes around the Cape of Good Hope when it comes to containerized shipping especially. So that now the world has adjusted to. We are working to provide not only resilient solution, but also innovative solutions. So transshipments via the Middle East, ERC, bridges, multimodal solutions as one way to deal with that situation. That's what we've always done. I would argue that's what we are good at, to work with the reality of the world and make the best out of it when it comes to logistics solutions for our customers.
Right. Let's come to India. India is an obvious beneficiary of the so-called China plus one trend that has got the world. Also, DHL has been always bullish about India, but the recent, today's announcement of 1 billion euros is, I think, one of the biggest that you've ever made, although it spans 5 years, and I think you've limited your investment announcements to 1 or 2 years. And the investment spans sectors from pharma to EVs. Will you tell me a little bit more about that?
So what we want to send is a clear signal also to our customers. We want to accelerate, and we will continue and even more so invest also ahead of need. That is something that we only do in very few markets. In markets that we're very certain about, Mexico is amongst them, for instance, Malaysia was amongst them, is amongst them. So India is now also on that list where we clearly say we're so confident that we build warehouses even though we don't have customers yet, that we build a cold chain infrastructure even though we know it's going to take time to convert certain customers to this type of solution. And also on the e-commerce side and on the ground transport side, B2B, the express business that we have with Blue Dart, that we invest there also in a bigger footprint, not so incremental. So that's the commitment we're making.
Right. It's been so long since you acquired Blue Dart. Why didn't you look at another one? There are so many nimble-footed companies that you could, acquire.
Well, I mean, our M&A strategy generally is focused on two things. We want to expand our geographical presence. One example in recent years was the acquisition of M&G Cargo in Turkey, for instance. It's a country where we did not have a parcel last mile business, so we added that. The other focus is adding capability. We have also, to pick one example, acquired recently CryoPDP, a specialist courier for cold chain that also has a strong presence here in India. So it's really elevating our capabilities that we have. These are the two focus areas. We generally don't want to buy market share. That's not what we think is value accretive.
But capabilities is what you would buy.
Capabilities is what we would buy. There's a special challenge in India that valuations are pretty high and it's also relatively difficult to delist companies. So that makes it unfortunately relatively hard to acquire here in the Indian market.
So India remains outside the purview of your acquisition lens?
No, it is not. We would be interested, but I think we also need to be realistic. If you want to merge two companies, you cannot have minority shareholders on both sides. You need to be able to integrate that, and that is something that in India, unfortunately, is relatively difficult. This is why really aggregating M&A has been rather difficult in this market.
Right. You spoke about valuation as a challenge, but the other direct challenge with Indian logistics continues to grapple with is that the logistics cost is still 10% of GDP. Why have we not been able to solve this? And DHL is too much of a veteran to not know this.
Well, it's infrastructure. I think that's the main game in town when it comes to bringing down that equation. It's not only road infrastructure, but that's obviously very important. There's great progress on that, but if you drive from here where we're sitting to downtown, there's positive evidence of that. If you drive from here to Bhiwandi, where logistics is, I would argue there's a little bit more work to be done. So that took me 2 hours the other day, which for that distance is a long time. So this is I think the key factor. Infrastructure is important on the road side. There's a lot happened on airports, which is positive. Mumbai also now coming up. Everybody waiting for that. A port infrastructure, coastal shipping being a very cost-efficient way to move goods. So as India progresses on this, the ratio will naturally come down. So I'm optimistic that we will see more efficient logistics that also provides greater benefit to people, better access at better prices, with infrastructure developing. That's clearly the future on that front.
Any plans to set up a hub in the Navi Mumbai airport? What are you planning?
So we have to see how we transition. I think there's ongoing discussions around that, what functions the old airport is going to serve, what's going to be in Navi Mumbai, whether it's a replica, whether there's a specific focus. For us, it's important that we can connect with our partners. We also transport freight, express and regular air freight with partner airlines, so-called belly space on passenger aircraft. That's an important element as well. And connectivity to second and third tier cities is part of our value proposition. So that's the ongoing discussion that we have as it relates to the Mumbai situation.
Right. Finally, tech and AI, and it is a large part of your operations also, not just customer facing and not just customer management, but also maybe predictive maintenance and stuff like that. How big an influence do you see this having in the logistics sector as a whole? And what are the risks that you are wary about?
So first of all, India also plays an important role in our IT strategy. IT Services is our in-house IT provider. About a third of the 6,000 people that we employ in that specific unit are now based in India.
Is that the largest chunk?
It's about balanced with the second largest location, which is in Prague. We also have a strong presence since over 25 years in Malaysia, where there's also one of our major data centers. But India has really been the fastest expanding, has been driving the growth of that unit, now with 5 centers, the latest one being in Indore. So that's a very positive contribution to our tech landscape in DHL. Now to your question more specifically, what does that technology do to our business?
Yeah.
I think firstly, I have a very positive mindset and view about that, because both on the physical side, AI being deployed as robots or being the brain of robots of the physical units, but also on the information side, it will first and foremost take away tedious work, physically straining work, boring work on the informational side, repetitive work, and that's very positive. I've recently seen how we deploy agentic AI when it comes to customs clearance. Is really fascinating to see, not only from an efficiency, from a productivity point of view, but also from a quality point of view. It's a perfectly documented process. You have a documentation of what documents on the customer side were considered, but also which rules were taken into account when a rating of a good happened for customs purposes. And that enables us to audit much better. And if there are changes in regulation, to react to that and have a perfect transparency around which rule went into the assessment of which good, which entry filing ultimately to customs. So that's an example that really shows what AI can do, not only about the productivity, which everybody's talking about, but also on the quality.
Finally, if you were to pick one trend that will influence the logistics sector significantly, and this is a trend we haven't spoken about in the last 25 minutes, what would you tell me?
Well, it's definitely decarbonization. Decarbonization is often mistaken as a political problem. It's not primarily a political problem, primarily it's a physical problem. And this is why it also doesn't go away. We need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. This first and foremost entails that we shouldn't add to it, but ultimately we need to bring down the concentration that we already have. Some people are not recognizing that the concentration has reached a level that is clearly not sustainable over the coming decades and centuries. So that pendulum, which now in certain parts of the world has gone to one extreme of more or less negating that necessity, I'm absolutely convinced that that will come back, and it's the task, it's also the duty of our generation to solve that problem.
On that note, thank you so much, Tobias, for joining us.
Thank you.